The first time I understood they had planned the weekend around my absence, I was standing on the front step of my mother's family's lake house with my overnight bag in one hand and a carton of strawberries in the other, while my cousin looked at me like I had shown up to the wrong address. It was such a small thing to notice in a moment like that. His face. Not anger exactly. Not surprise either. Surprise would have at least meant I still belonged inside the range of normal possibilities. What Eli looked like was inconvenienced. Prepared. Like I had stepped into a version of the evening that had already been arranged and my body was the only part that hadn't gotten the memo. The lake was behind me, flat and blue in that late summer way that always made everything look more forgiving than it was. The house still had the same cedar siding, the same long screen porch, the same uneven stone path my grandfather had insisted on laying himself because he said straight lines made a place feel too proud. For 1 week second before Eli opened the door, I had let myself believe memory might do some of the work for me, that I could walk and hand somebody the strawberries, accept the slightly strained hug from Aunt Nora, and survive one weekend inside a version of family that no longer fit but still technically existed. Then Eli opened the door halfway and did not move aside. Avery. That was all he said at first. Just my name. But people can do a lot with a name when they want it to mean, "Why are you here?" "Hi," I said. Traffic was better than I thought, so I made good time. He glanced past me toward the driveway like he expected someone else to be with me, maybe as a buffer, maybe as a witness. When he saw I was alone, something in his shoulders settled into place. "This isn't really a good time," I let out, the kind of laugh you make when you are still trying to help another person behave normally. "Okay." "For unloading the car, or for saying hi," he didn't smile. "You should have called." I looked at him for a second. "For the family weekend, Avery." His voice dropped patient in a way that made me instantly tired. "Mom's trying to keep things calm this weekend." There are sentences that only sound neutral if you have never been on the receiving end of them before. Keep things calm. It was the kind of phrase people in my family used when they wanted to describe somebody else's feelings as a disruption, before those feelings had even been expressed. I shifted the strawberries to my other hand. "I'm not here to start anything. I'm here for the lake weekend, the same one we've had every August since I was 8. His mouth tightened. "It's a little different this year." Before I could answer, I heard voices inside. Glasses clinking. A burst of laughter, the screen door to the porch opening and closing, the sound of people already being comfortable, and beneath that another sound. My aunt's voice lower than usual saying, "Who is it?" Eli stepped back just enough to turn his head. "It's Avery." There was a beat, not long, just long enough. Then Nora appeared behind him in a white linen shirt and expensive-looking jeans, the kind of outfit that managed to look effortless in a way that required planning. She had always been beautiful in a controlled way, not warm, beautiful, maintained. She took in the bag in my hand, the overnight bag at my feet, the fact that I was standing there expecting to be let in, and smiled with a sadness so polished it was almost insulting. "Oh, Avery." It hit me then that I had already lost something and I hadn't even crossed the threshold. "I know we probably should have all communicated better," she said. "This weekend is just a little tight." "Tight how?" "In general." She gave that small shrug people use when they want vagueness to sound reasonable. "Space, emotions, expectations. After everything these last couple years, I really wanted to keep this simple." I stared at her. "I'm sorry. Are you saying I'm not staying here?" Nora's expression shifted by half an inch, enough to suggest that I was the one making the conversation ungenerous. "I'm saying we didn't know you were coming, sweetheart. My mother used to call me sweetheart. Nora only ever used it when she wanted me smaller." "It's the family weekend," I said. I could hear my own voice flattening, which always happened right before I got called cold. Why would I need to announce that I was coming to my own family's lake house? Eli exhaled sharply through his nose like I was proving some point for him. Nora kept her face composed. "Let's not do this on the porch." "Then where are we doing it, Avery?" She looked over my shoulder toward the driveway, then back at me. "There are people here. I don't want a scene." That was the moment the humiliation really landed. Not because she was turning me away. Because she was doing it in the careful language of hospitality, as though I was the one threatening good manners by noticing what was happening. I glanced past them into the house. The first thing I saw was the hall table. It used to hold a blue ceramic bowl for keys and my mother's framed photo from the summer she turned 27, hair up in a scarf smelling into wind off the water. The bowl was still there. The picture was gone. In its place stood a tall glass vase with white hydrangeas that looked too arranged to be accidental. Then I saw the living room beyond it. One of the old quilts from the upstairs linen closet had been folded over the back of the sofa. Not draped. Folded. Decorative. Somebody had lit the brass lamp my grandfather always said made everyone look kinder than they deserved. On the far side of the room, two women I barely knew were unpacking tote bags like they'd already been assigned their places in the house. Assigned. I don't know why that particular thought hurt so much. Maybe because it meant the weekend had shape already. Names attached to rooms, plates counted out, beds claimed. And none of it had included me. Whose room am I in? I asked, still looking past them. Neither of them answered right away. Then Eli said, "There isn't one." I turned back to him. Nora made a soft sound, like the bluntness had embarrassed her more than the meaning itself. We had to make some practical choices. Practical for who? For the people who've actually been here handling things, Eli said. Nora cut him a quick look, but it was too late. There it was. Not the whole truth, but a piece of the real one. The moral language under the logistics. Handling things. As if grief had been a shift, some people worked and others skipped. I set the strawberries down on the porch rail because suddenly I couldn't hold one more symbol of my own good faith. I helped clean this place every Labor Day from the time I was 12, I said. I know where the extra blankets are. I know which window in the upstairs hall sticks when it rains, and I know my mother paid for the roof repair the year your insurance claim got held up, so don't stand there and talk to me like I wandered into an Airbnb by mistake. Eli's face hardened. Nora's softened further, which was worse. No one is saying that, she said gently. But that was exactly what they were saying. They were just saying it in the accent of good breeding. A burst of laughter came from deeper in the house again, and then I heard someone ask, "Everything okay out there?" Nora answered, without taking her eyes off me, just a little arrival confusion. Arrival confusion. I think that was the point when something inside me went still. Not better, not calmer, just still. Because the thing about being treated like the difficult one for long enough is that eventually you get very good at hearing the machinery underneath the sentence. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't awkwardness. This was a version of the evening that had been rehearsed in softer language before I got here. A figure moved in the background, then passing from the dining room toward the kitchen. Older. Familiar. Margot Reyes. My mother's best friend. She slowed when she saw me on the porch. Just for a second. Long enough for her face to change. Not surprise. Recognition, and then something worse. Concern. Nora shifted slightly enough to block the sightline. "Why don't you get a room in town tonight? We can all talk tomorrow when things are less charged." Less charged. Meaning after I had been removed. I bent to pick up my overnight bag. The zipper pocket brushed against my wrist. Inside it, wrapped in an old sweater I still hadn't been able to throw away because it smelled faintly like my mother's perfume if I pressed hard enough, were the papers I had found 3 weeks earlier in a storage box she had labeled Summer Misk. The original deed. 2 letters. A set of copies I'd told myself I was only bringing because carrying them made me feel less foolish, less sentimental, less alone. I did not take them out. Not yet. I looked at Nora, then at Eli, and then past them into the house that had taught me half my memories. The hydrangeas, the missing photo, the women unpacking into rooms that apparently no longer had space for me. From somewhere upstairs, a man's voice said, "Hey, Eli, are we still talking about opening up the back bedrooms next spring? When you redo the upstairs?" Eli turned his head instinctively toward the sound. Next spring. Redo the upstairs. Like the future had already been discussed. Budgeted. Assigned. Like I was not standing 3 feet away. That was when I understood. This was bigger than a humiliating welcome. Bigger than Nora deciding to be difficult. They weren't just making me uncomfortable enough to leave. They were speaking about the house as if my disappearance had already been agreed on. I picked up the strawberries again because leaving them there suddenly felt like surrendering evidence. "Get your hotel," Eli said, recovering his voice. "We'll sort this out tomorrow." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "No. You'll tell me tomorrow what exactly you think there is to sort out." And I walked back down the stone path with my overnight bag in one hand and my mother's papers in the other, still zipped shut, suddenly heavier than they had felt when I packed them. I drove into town before the shaking in my hands could turn into something more humiliating than anger. The inn off the main road had the same faded navy awning it had when my mother used to bring me there for pancakes on rainy mornings if the power went out at the lake. The woman at the desk gave me a room key with a plastic float attached to it and said, "Long weekend crowd," in the cheerful tone people use when they assume everyone in a lake town is here for something pleasant. Something like that, I said. Inside the room, I locked the door, set my overnight bag on the bed, and just stood there looking at it. It is embarrassing how long it can take to open the thing you already know matters. I had found the papers 3 weeks earlier in one of the last storage boxes from my mother's condo, tucked under a stack of old beach towels and a canvas toiletry bag with a broken zipper. The envelope had my name on it in her handwriting, but only my first name. Not Avery if things get ugly, not in case there's a dispute, just Avery. Like she had still believed there was a version of the world in which I would open it because she wanted me to have something, not because she expected me to defend myself from family. I unwrapped the old sweater and laid the documents flat on the bedspread. The deed. A letter from an attorney's office. A handwritten note from my mother that was only 6 lines long and somehow more painful than anything longer would have been. If this ever becomes necessary, you'll know why. I'm sorry I didn't explain it better while I was alive. I kept hoping love would do what paperwork shouldn't have to. Don't let anyone make you feel like remembering is the same thing as causing trouble. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read that line 3 times. Then I called Ben. He answered on the 4th ring, and I knew from the silence before his hello that he had already heard something. "Where are you?" he asked. "The Harbor Inn." Another pause. "Okay." That okay irritated me more than anything dramatic could have. It was the sound of a person stepping carefully around a mess he had known was spreading. "You knew," I said. "I knew there was tension." "You knew more than that." He exhaled. I could picture him rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when he wanted time he hadn't earned. "Avery, no. Don't do that thing where you start by softening me up for the version that hurts less." I stood on that porch like a stranger, Ben. His voice changed then. Lost some of its defensive distance. "I know. Did you—" He was quiet for a second. "Mom started hearing stuff from Nora months ago. Not legal stuff, not exactly. Just language. That she was the one handling the place now. That after your mom passed, somebody had to keep things moving. That you weren't around much and didn't want the burden." I actually laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because it was so cleanly cruel. I didn't want the burden. "I'm telling you what she said." "And you didn't think that was worth mentioning to me?" "I thought it was grief at first," he said. "Then I thought maybe it was just Nora doing what Nora does, acting like logistics make her queen of the earth." Then enough time passed that not saying anything felt easier than saying, "Hey, by the way, Aunt Nora's been slowly narrating you out of the lake house." That one landed because it was honest. I looked down at the papers on the bed. "So it wasn't just tonight?" "No." "How bad is it?" He hesitated again, and in our family hesitation was usually where the truth lived. "Ben." "She talks like it's settled," he said finally. "Not in front of everybody all the time, but enough. Like upkeep equals ownership. Like being the one who organized repairs and taxes gives her moral authority. Eli's worse. He talks about the house like he's already inheriting a version of it." I close my eyes. There is a point where hurt turns into something cleaner. Not easier. Just cleaner. The question stops being "did this happen?" and becomes "how long?" "I found papers," I said. "What kind of papers?" "Deed papers. Something Mom left." The line went still. "Real ones. I work in a law office, remember. I know the difference between sentimental documents and documents that make people nervous. Do you know what they mean?" "Enough to know Nora shouldn't be acting like this." Ben was quiet, then said, "You need someone older in this who knew what your mom intended. Talk to Margot. I saw her tonight. At the house. She looked at me like she already knew I'd been sent away. That bothered him. I could hear it. I'm driving up in the morning. You should have been here tonight." "I know. The thing about apologies from people who love you but failed you is that they can be both sincere and insufficient." I let the silence sit there between us for a second before I said, "Call me when you get close." After I hung up, I texted Margot, "Can I see you tomorrow morning?" "Please don't tell Nora." She answered in under a minute, "Yes." 9, Dockside Cafe. I barely slept. The next morning, the cafe smelled like coffee and butter and lake water from people coming in off the docks. Margot was already there in a pale green cardigan, both hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. She stood when she saw me, and the hug she gave me was careful in a way that made it worse. Like she knew I might break in a place I had not consented to break. "I'm sorry," she said before we even sat down. "For what part?" Her eyes flicked down. "For not speaking sooner." That was not the answer of somebody who had simply witnessed a misunderstanding. I took the seat across from her and set the envelope on the table between us. "How much did my mother tell you?" Margot looked at the papers, then back at me. "Not everything. Enough." "Enough what?" "Enough to know she worried about Nora." I felt something cold move through my chest. Worried how Margot folded her hands. Not that Nora would do something crude. Your mother never imagined forged signatures or open theft. That wasn't it. She worried Nora would confuse caretaking with entitlement, that she would be the one paying bills, arranging contractors, making phone calls, and eventually start speaking as though doing those things made the place morally hers. I sat very still. She said Nora respected process when process favored her. Margot went on quietly. And sentiment when sentiment favored her, but not fairness if fairness cost her control. That sounded exactly like my aunt. Not villainous. Worse. Accurate. She did something I said, nodding toward the envelope. Margot nodded back. She told me once years ago that she had handled the lake house paperwork so you wouldn't be at anyone's mercy. She didn't tell me the details. She just said she needed to know no one could gently push you out later and call it practicality. I looked down at the handwritten note again. I kept hoping love would do what paperwork shouldn't have to. For a second I could not speak at all. Margot's face softened. Your mother loved her sister. That was the tragedy of it. She wasn't planning against a monster. She was protecting you from a family habit. That sentence stayed with me. Not a monster, a family habit. By the time I left the cafe, the hurt had changed shape again. It wasn't softer. It was steadier. My mother had seen something I'd spent years trying to call personality instead of pattern, and she had acted on it quietly because she still hoped quiet action would be enough. Back at the inn, I called Diane Mercer. She had worked title questions in Charlevoix County long enough that everybody in 3 towns seemed to know her name, and I'd met her once the summer before my mother got sick when there had been a minor filing issue with a dock easement. She remembered me immediately. Avery Callahan, she said. You sound like your mother. The kindness in that almost undid me, but I held on. I need to ask you something informal, I said. And I know you can't give me personal legal advice. I can tell you whether a document is nonsense, she said. Sometimes that's enough. It turned out it was. I read her the deed language, every line that mattered, my finger tracing the words as I spoke them. She asked 2 questions, then 3 more, all precise. When I finished, she was quiet in a professional way, not a doubtful one. Well, she said, that is certainly not meaningless paper. My shoulders went tight. How not meaningless? If the documents are what you're describing, then no one should be speaking as though this property simply folded into one person's control by force of personality. At minimum, it's incomplete. At worst, someone is relying on the rest of the family, not understanding the difference between managing a place and owning an interest in it. I stared at the wall. So, I'm not imagining this. No, she said. You are absolutely not imagining this. I thanked her and hung up. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Nora. I'm sorry last night was awkward. If you'd like to come by for drinks before dinner, please do. Let's all try to keep things pleasant. Pleasant. That word made something in me settle all the way down. I showered, changed, and drove back. The house looked even more offensively beautiful in daylight. The lake was glittering. Somebody had put out striped towels on the porch rail. A platter of cheese and crackers sat on the outdoor table like good manners could erase the previous night. When I walked up this time, Nora herself opened the door. Avery, she said, with the calm smile of a woman receiving someone she had not tried to exile 12 hours earlier. I'm glad you came back. I met her eyes. You invited me. Yes, because I'd like us to move forward in a better spirit. That was the thing with Nora. She never said, forget what I did. She said, let's move forward, which is how people like her make amnesia sound mature. Inside, conversations softened for a beat and then resumed. I caught the quick glance of a woman from the night before, the kind people exchange when they know enough to be curious but not enough to be ashamed. Nora guided me toward the screen porch with 2 fingers lightly at my elbow, a gesture so publicly gentle it was almost a threat. On the porch, Eli stood near the drinks table talking to a man in boat shoes about contractor bids. He didn't stop when he saw me, and if we open the upstairs and make the bunks built in, we could sleep 3 more families easy next summer, he was saying. Mom wants to do it right. Not cheap. Mom wants to do it right. Not Aunt Nora hopes. Not we're discussing options. Mom wants. The man nodded. Smart. Especially if you're keeping it long term. Eli smiled. That's the plan. I felt the anger arrive then, not hot and messy but cold enough to see through. This was not them hoping I would drift away. This was them furnishing the future around my disappearance. Then Nora, standing just behind me with a tray of glasses, said to one of the women from town in that lowered, explanatory voice meant to sound gracious, Avery's just very emotional about the house. Of course we all understand that. But she doesn't really have standing in the decisions anymore, and sometimes grief makes people hold on in ways that aren't healthy. I turned before she finished the last word. She stopped when she saw my face. There it was. Clean. Public. Not implied. Not softened enough to miss. No real standing, not just in her private mind. In the story she had been feeding other people. In that moment, part 3 stopped being a possibility and became a duty. I was done trying to decide whether this could still be handled quietly. Quiet was the weapon. Quiet was how I had been turned into a guest in my own mother's history. I looked at Nora, then at Eli, then at the people around them who had been taught to read me as the difficult one before I ever opened my mouth, and I knew I was not leaving that house again without opening the bag. I looked at Nora for one more second, then set my bag down on the floor beside the porch table. The conversations around us had thinned without fully stopping. That was how these things happened in my family. Nobody wanted to be caught staring, but nobody wanted to miss anything either. The screen door knocked lightly in the breeze. Someone had set out a bowl of olives no one was touching. Beyond the porch, the lake kept glittering as if nothing human had ever happened near it. "Nora," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I felt before you explained me to anyone else. "I think we need to be very clear about what you've been telling people this house is." There was a small shift in the room then. Not panic. Attention. Nora set the tray down carefully. "Avery, this is not the time. It became the time when you told strangers, I have no standing here." One of the women from town looked down into her wine glass immediately. Eli straightened, already preparing himself for the role he liked best, which was reasonable young man forced to deal with difficult female relative. "You're twisting what she meant," he said. "No," I said without looking at him. "I'm repeating it." Nora gave a short pained smile, the kind meant to make everyone else feel sorry for her restraint. "I was trying to keep the afternoon pleasant. You clearly came back looking for a fight." That word almost made me laugh. Fight. As if the only aggression in the last 24 hours had been my refusal to quietly accept what they were doing. "I came back," I said, "because last night I was treated like I was crashing a house I grew up in, and this afternoon you told people I have no standing here. So, no, I'm not looking for a fight. I'm correcting a lie." Eli let out a breath through his nose. "Jesus, Avery." "There it is," I said, turning to him now. "That tone, like I'm the embarrassing part, not the fact that you tried to send me to a hotel for my own family's lake weekend." Nora stepped in before he could answer. "This is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes a referendum with you." We were trying to be practical. Practical is telling me the sleeping arrangements changed. Practical is asking me to come a day later. Practical is not building an entire social version of this house where my mother's daughter is treated like an intruder. Her face changed at that, just slightly, enough for me to know I'd finally said the thing she had been working hardest to keep unsaid in public. "Avery," she said softly, "your grief is real. No one is denying that. But grief does not automatically entitle you to disrupt decisions that have been made by the people who stayed and handled everything." That landed exactly the way she intended. Not as a scream, as a verdict. The people who stayed, the people who handled everything. The language of care used like a deed. I bent down, unzipped my overnight bag, and took out the envelope. The room got quieter. That was the strange thing. I had imagined this moment if it ever came as loud. But the actual feeling was not loud. It was almost clean, like setting something on a table that had been hidden under a cloth too long. Nora saw the envelope and went still. I took out the papers and laid them flat beside the bowl of olives. "I work in a real estate law office," I said. "So I've spent enough time around people misusing documents to know the difference between old family paperwork and something that matters. These matter." Eli glanced at his mother before he looked down. "What is this supposed to be, this?" I said. Touching the top page is the original deed transfer documentation my mother left among her papers. The house did not simply become yours to narrate after she died. Her interest did not vanish because you paid a tax bill and hired a roofer. A flush moved up his neck. "That's not what anyone said. It is exactly what you said. Maybe not in those words. But when you talk about redoing the upstairs next spring, and when she tells people I have no standing here, that's the story." Nora's voice grew even calmer, which meant she was rattled. "Avery, if you found some old paperwork, that doesn't mean you understand the full legal picture." I nodded once. That would be a better argument if I hadn't already checked. That caught her. "With who?" Eli said too quickly. "Diane Mercer." The name landed harder than I expected. Nora's eyes sharpened. She knew exactly who Diane was. I kept going before anyone could interrupt. "I read her the language this morning. She told me these documents are not symbolic, not sentimental, and not meaningless. At minimum, your version of authority over this house is incomplete. At worst, you've been counting on everyone here not understanding the difference between managing a property and owning an interest in it. Nobody said anything for a second. Then one of the men from town, the one in the boat shoes, cleared his throat and stepped back from the porch rail like he had accidentally touched something hot. Nora tried once more. Even if there are technical details that need reviewing, this is still incredibly inappropriate. That was the last refuge she had left. Not truth. Tone. Behind me, the screen door opened. I turned and saw Ben step onto the porch. He looked from me to the papers to Nora, and something in his face settled into place. No, he said. What's inappropriate is pretending you didn't know there was a question here. Nora stared at him. Ben, do not make this worse. Worse than what he asked, worse than letting Avery get treated like she was some unstable cousin who showed up drunk and confused. Worse than listening to you talk about this house for months like it had already folded neatly into your side of the family. A small sound escaped Nora then. Not outrage. Something closer to disbelief that he had said it out loud. Eli jumped in. You don't even know what you're talking about. I know enough, Ben said. I know you've both been talking about this place like its future was already settled. The porch door opened again before Eli could answer, and Margot came out. She did not move quickly. That was part of what gave her weight. She crossed to the table, looked down at the papers, then up at Nora. I think she said quietly that what Avery is talking about is exactly what her mother was afraid of. No one moved. Margot turned to the others, the guests, the cousins, the people who had been fed this whole thing as a matter of practical family management. Her mother told me years ago that she had handled the lake house paperwork so Avery would never be at anyone's mercy. She did not think anyone would commit some dramatic act of theft. She worried about something much more polite than that. I felt my throat tighten. Margot looked straight at Nora. She worried Avery would be softened out of her place and made to look unreasonable for noticing. That did it. Not because it was theatrical, because it was exact. Nora's face lost its arrangement. For the first time all weekend, she did not have a sentence ready fast enough to make it sound harmless. Eli started to speak, stopped, then looked at the papers again, with the expression of someone realizing the room was no longer tilted the way he had counted on. I put one hand flat over the handwritten note from my mother, not to hide it, just to steady myself. This I said, and I could hear the tremor under the control. Now is the part I need all of you to understand. This is not just about whether I have paperwork. It's about the fact that you wanted me to feel ashamed for showing up here. You wanted me to look needy, dramatic, unstable, tacky, like loving this place too much was some kind of personal failing. My voice got quieter after that, which made everyone lean in. This is the last place in the world that still feels like my mother to me, and instead of telling the truth, you tried to make my presence look embarrassing. The silence after that was different. Not polite, human. One of the women set down her glass. The man in the boat shoes looked at Nora, then away. Ben stood with his arms folded, not triumphant, just done. Margot's eyes were wet. Nora found her voice eventually. I never said you didn't love your mother. No, I said. You just tried to make that love look like bad behavior. Her mouth opened, then closed. There was nowhere left for her to stand except inside the thing she had done, and for a woman like Nora, that was worse than being shouted at. She had built her authority out of being the calmest person in the room. Now calm made her look exactly what she was, a person who had mistaken management for moral ownership. I gathered the papers back into the envelope carefully, not like a winner collecting trophies, but like someone finally taking custody of something that should never have been made necessary. Here's what's going to happen, I said. No one is making plans for this house. No renovations, no bookings, no more casual talk about its future like I don't exist. I'll have council review everything formally when I get back to Cincinnati, and whatever happens next will happen through process, not through whoever sounds most reasonable over drinks. Eli actually looked offended. So you're just blowing up the family over paperwork? I looked at him. No. The family blew itself up the minute it decided I was easier to erase than include. Then I picked up my bag. Nora took one small step forward. Avery. I turned. For a second I thought she might apologize. Not fully maybe, but enough to prove she still understood the shape of the damage. Instead, she said, I did keep this place going. And there it was. Her truest sentence. Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. Just the last piece of the story she still needed preserved. I know, I said. But keeping a place going is not the same thing as owning the people attached to it. I left the porch before anyone could answer. Outside, the late light had gone softer. The stone path still dipped in the same place near the lilac bushes. The dock stretched into the water like a sentence my childhood had once known by heart. I stood there for a minute with my bag hanging from my shoulder and looked back at the house. It was still beautiful. That was the hardest part maybe, not discovering the lie. Discovering that the lie had not ruined the beauty, only my access to innocence inside it. The upstairs windows were glowing gold. Somewhere in their rooms were still arranged wrong. My mother's photo was probably still missing from the hall table. The weekend would not magically heal because the truth had finally been spoken. There would be phone calls, lawyers, people choosing sides too late and calling it sorrow. Ben would probably stay behind long enough to absorb some of the fallout. Margot would go home and blame herself for not intervening sooner. Nora would spend months explaining to herself that she had only ever been practical. But the place no longer belonged to her version of events. I walked down to the dock before I got in the car. The boards were warm from the day's sun. At the end of it, I crouched and touched the lake with my fingertips the way my mother used to do every first evening we arrived, like she was greeting something alive. The water was cold and clean. For the first time all weekend, I let myself cry. Not because I had lost, not even because I had won, just because I was tired of needing proof in places where love should have been enough. When I finally stood up, the house behind me was reflected in the darkening water, blurred just enough to look gentler than it was. I took one last look, then walked back toward shore, carrying my bag, my mother's papers, and something I had not had when I arrived. Not peace, something better, the right to stop calling silence love.